Hey everyone, welcome to the first section of the video. In this section, I wanted to go over some of the references I gathered to help illustrate the differences between the different styles of rocks that we'll be sculpting later on throughout the video. Now, I don't own any of these images. They're being used purely for educational purposes to demonstrate different styles, so I won't be trying to emulate any particular rock that you see here, but rather show my approach to how I sculpt in these different styles. So as you can see on the left side, we have really stylized looking rocks, and then as we move closer to the right, they go and they get a little bit more realistic all the way till we get to the very end here, where we're going to start looking at, and on the right side here, we have hyper realistic looking sculpts and also photos. So the way that I kind of want to start this is I'm going to start looking at the more very stylized, simplistic rocks, and that's what we're going to start sculpting, eventually make our way to the sort of midway between stylized and hyper real. And then finally, we're going to end up making our way over to the hyper-realistic side. So the first thing that I do when I gather all of these references is I start to study them. And one of the things that I do when I study them is I just look at like what's common between all of these images. And one of the most common things is that the forms here and all of these images are very, very simple. There's not a lot of high resolution detail. There's just a lot of like big major form changes, and there's every once in a while there's like some cracks here and there in all of these, but for the most part they're very simple. They're very chunky and blocky. Even when you get into images like this where it's sharp but still there's big forms going on. And just so you can understand better what I'm saying, if I just take a marker here, so I look at something like a rock like this and I start to look at it in terms of its form changes. Something just like this, right? These have all these different planar cuts to them. Something like that, right? So that's something that I do with these rocks, and let's do this rock here. So I could even do something like this, and then within this it has some like micro cuts. But for the most part, right, like it's very simple. There's not a whole lot of different breakups going on. So I could do that for all of these, but I think you get the point there. I'm also looking at a lot of the surface detail, and you can see in some of these sculpts, I mean, there's a little bit going on. It's not just completely flat. There's every once in a while you get sort of a little indentation or like a crack, or you get this little kind of like mark in there. And that could be said about all of these, right? Like you don't have just sheer planar faces. There's always just a little bit of detail going on. I'm also noticing that there's a lot of sort of like these bevels on the edges of the rocks. It's not a completely 90-degree cut corner. And also the last thing is that the forms here are pretty exaggerated. A lot of these you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in nature, but you'll discover that as we go along with this course that a lot of these actually just relate to one another, right? Like the very stylized look is sort of the base for doing a lot more detailed rocks. So there is a lot of correlation between these two, and I'll explain that later as we keep going. Another thing to notice with a lot of the stylized stuff is that the forms are very intentional and they're very big and obvious, right? Like there's a lot of different cuts and like just simple forms. So when you're running through a game in a very stylized game, they're not trying to get you to stop and necessarily like look at the rock. The players just need to know that it's a rock. So you can get away with doing really, really simple forms. And lastly, one thing to note is that there's no really like visible brush marks that you see here. Everything is sculpted really intentionally to be very, very simple. So a lot of the times you'll see in sculpts that you can see the actual leftover brush alphas, and we're going to really try to avoid that when we're sculpting in this very stylized method. And so when I'm going along and I'm sculpting all of this stuff, I'm going to keep remembering some of these different words that'll help me sort of reinforce what I'm sculpting. So planar is something that I keep remembering to tell myself, and also sharp and nice clean cuts All of these things you just sort of think about when you're sculpting, and it actually really does help to keep you on track. So when you start, if you have the tendency to start sculpting and over sculpting and putting a lot of details, you can just remember, oh, simple forms, nice clean cuts. And then you can kind of just go back over if you sculpted a little bit too much. Okay, so next let's talk about the sort of like mid-level between hyperreal and really, really stylized. This one's probably going to be the most difficult just because it is in that sort of gray area between like it could almost be realistic if you put it in a very realistic game, and it could also almost be really, really stylized if you put it in a stylized game. So the key differences here between stylized and this mid-level, to me at least, what I think is that there's just a little bit more detail going on. You get a lot more planar changes in the forms, but also there is some like visible brush marks that are left behind, which is actually okay because it adds to that textural element of the rock, and that's a good thing. But you can see the different correlation between the stylized and the mid-level stylized. What we can see is that there's still really nice planar cuts. We get nice form changes in here that the stylized rocks have. We still get exaggerated forms. And I think the big key difference here, I mentioned that it's not noisy for the stylized rocks. Well, with these rocks, there's definitely going to be an added level of noise to it for sure, because we need some of that to sort of help pull it out of that really realistic look. And something that I did, I actually gathered a bunch of painting reference because having painted myself a little bit and listening to other painters, what they try to do is it's kind of impossible to paint every single little crack in a rock when you're doing a landscape painting like this. So I chose these because there's a lot of implied forms going on. These rocks, they're realistic. They were painted in the actual world here, but it's not 100%, right? Like you're not seeing the fine grain and all of that. That's if you go up and look at a rock close up, you're kind of missing that. So the big thing here is it's implied detail, and that's something that I think about when I'm sculpting this style of rock. So if I were to kind of translate that into like sculpting terms, that could mean something just like stamping a rock alpha down and then kind of just sculpting over it a little bit to just imply that, there's some cracks here or there's, a plane change with some detail. That's what I'm referring to, and I'll explain that more when we get to this level of sculpting as well. So that kind of wraps up this sort of in-between style. So if we go ahead and we look at the realistic rocks, the obvious thing with these is that there's a ton of noise. There's a lot of different breakup and planar changes in these, and we are going for, hyper real rocks that exist in the real world. So there's tons of detail, which means that we're going to be using a lot of alphas to help pull out that detail and using a lot of like micro noise to help pull it out. The main thing here is that we're not going to be really exaggerating the forms like we would in the stylized versions of the rock. We're going to be pretty much trying to ground these sculpts in a realistic setting. So that way, if they were in a realistic looking game, a player wouldn't necessarily do a double take, because it would stand out as not correct looking and it would fit in the natural world. And that's the sort of difference between the very hyper realistic stuff and this sort of mid tier. So you can see, even if I took a sculpt like this and a sculpt like this, you can see that there's just so much more going on. And this, even a section like this, right? There's a ton of cracks. There's a ton of like little micro detail, whereas in this one, there's not a lot of that micro detail. You are getting some planar forms in here, but between these two, I could easily look at this and say, oh yeah, this would fit in the natural world. So that about sums up this part of the tutorial. Throughout the rest of the videos, I'll definitely be bringing this back in to sort of illustrate a point and just to use it as reference to help explain things. So I would highly encourage all of you, whichever style you choose to sculpt in, if you want to sculpt in all three or more stylized, that when you find references that you really like that you're trying to emulate, that you really study them a lot and figure out, why the forms are the way they are. Why is it stylized, right? What makes it stylized, or what makes it really realistic? What are some of the forms and the features that stand out to you to make it that way? That really helps. I do that every time I sculpt and trying to get better at understanding a certain style because there's no way that I can't do all these styles perfectly. That's something that it just takes a lot of practice to do. So with that said, I will see you in the next video.